Yup, we are live. It's your man Eddie Ed.
Hey, folks, welcome. It's Dialogue.
Yes. We are here with another live stream. As you guys can see, the thumbnail and the title, we have a guest today that we're bringing on. But before we get into that, make sure you guys subscribe if you're new, and if you rock with the content, smash the like button. Let all the channels know that you guys are liking the content, so it can help the algorithm, so we can
hmm
get reach more people. And drop a comment down below. We love interacting with the guests, with newcomers, whoever you are, down in the comments. So if you have something you disagree with, have something you agree with, drop it down below, and we would like to have a chat in the chat. So do that, and we much appreciate it. Um, so we'll start off like this. The guest that we're bringing on, um, he was raised Catholic, a former Christian as well. Left Christianity and turned to what is known as Wicca, and looked into parapsychology in his college years. Is kind of his trail, and then now he professes to be an atheist. So that's our guest for today, and we're gonna bring him on to have like sort of an interview, kind of get to know the side of an atheist, what they think about biblical things, biblical topics, and essentially how it applies to life, or if it does not apply to life. So, you guys, welcome into the stage here. We got James.
Hey,
Hey, James.
everybody. Hi, thanks for
Hey,
having me on again. Yeah.
for sure. We're gonna go ahead and actually play a preview video from the last episode that we had with him. So let's go ahead and show that.
I'm not a biblical scholar. I have no training, obviously, in this. Like I said, I just started the last 6 months. So if there's anyone out there who has, a great deal of knowledge about the Bible and biblical Hebrew, no doubt you can correct me on these things. He's going down to the seaport, down to the ship. He goes into the belly of the ship. This dude is running from God. And you're like, okay, that's a little spicy for a prophet. Let's see what happens. Jonah goes up and goes, y'all are wicked. You need to change your ways. Like, there's no struggle here. These people fold like a house of cards. I knew it! I hate the Ninevehs so much, and I knew that you're a good God, and that you were gonna forgive them. And that's why I would have rather died.
Oftentimes, God will use outside things to show Israel and sometimes prophets how foolish they're being, how, for lack of a better term, they're taking God for granted.
A person being swallowed up, and not only swallowed up, but being taken down for 3 days, and then arriving to wherever. Like, I think that in itself, I think that shows divine ordinance, divine intervention.
The moment you begin to take out the deity aspect of a story, like 90% of the story has to become fiction because you've removed the whole point of the story.
All right, so that was a little bit of the first time we had him on. So we're gonna go straight into the questions here. But before we do start, we just ask that as we go through the questions, to keep everything in order, and to kind of be in the frame of time, to keep the questions or the answers related to the question as best as possible, so that we can not dive into maybe subtopics or anything like that. So we're going to be concise. So we just ask that, and I think other than that, we're good.
Yeah, sounds good. And first, and real quick, thank you for having me on. Apologies for missing last time. And that was an awesome intro, guys. As someone who's played with the video a bit, seeing the filters and everything, well done, great production. So I've never seen myself in that format before. I think you did a great job.
Yeah, it
We
was fun.
appreciate it. We appreciate it. Okay, so for this first question, we want to start here. We thought this was a good place to start to kind of build off of. So we know, we know in life, on Earth, you are born at a particular time, and then eventually down the line, you die. You leave this Earth, right? We can understand that as a natural pattern, of life on Earth. We who believe, that the Bible is the Word of God, and know through Scripture that we go through, or that we go to one of two places, after we die, which is heaven or hell, right? That will be known as, I'll call it as a supernatural, understanding, or like supernatural, like more beyond the earth, right? Understanding of what happens after death, or departing from the body. Um, so what do you believe happens after we die?
Well,
Real
if
quick,
I
real quick. Can we
Mhm.
can we start the timer before we begin?
Let's do that. Let's do
Yeah,
that.
forgot.
Okay, we got the timer here.
Yeah,
Let's go. Thank you.
yeah.
So I mean, there's two answers to that. One, I don't think that anything happens after death. I think the brain ceases to exist. I'm a naturalist, so I think I am my brain, essentially. So when the brain ends, consciousness ends, and that's it. I know there are non-theistic views of, like, reincarnation or souls that may exist, but I don't currently believe that. I think we just end.
Think we just end. I actually meant to ask you this before we even got to the question, just for clarity purposes, because I do think there's a couple of different, from what I heard from people, types of atheism or atheists. What would you describe? What kind of atheist would you describe yourself as in this regard?
No, it's a great question, because kind of like if someone says they're Christian, there's so many different versions of Christianity someone could
Yeah,
be. For me, atheists can only answer one thing: do I believe a God exists in some format? And right now, I don't.
gotcha.
It doesn't tell me or anyone else anything other than that. So an atheist could believe in, like, reincarnation or
Hmm.
spirits. I'm not one of those. So I would say I'm just a naturalistic atheist. I don't think the supernatural exists in any format, but I am
Gotcha.
open, as you talked about my study of parapsychology, I'm open to the idea. I just currently
Yeah.
don't believe the supernatural exists.
Okay, so hopefully the audience, heard it, and it is a little clear on where you are with that. So that's great. Thank you for explaining that.
Mhm.
So a follow-up question is about what do you believe happens after we die? Um, so what leads you to that conclusion of nothing happens, after we die, we just cease to exist? Is there any evidence, any intuition or something else?
Um, I think we all, like, we grew up with stories about whether it's religion, or ghosts or spirits or resurrections. So it's in our literature. Lord of the Rings, Gandalf dies and comes back as something better, right? So I'm a product of my civilization, my family, my upbringing. So yeah, I mean that's on my mind. It would be nice if it was true. My dad, who joked that he was a druid, I would call him an agnostic, but he told me once his idea of an afterlife is he would love to go back and see history play out, to see all the details of what really happened, in the past. For him, that was something he imagined the afterlife was kind of like. But so it would be nice if there was some, fairness to the universe, some afterlife, but I just haven't seen anything that's convincing so far. I know there's many claims, and I know people have personal experiences, and I can't really argue against a personal experience. But for myself right now, I just don't. I don't think there's anything after it.
Gotcha. So okay. So you did state that you think consciousness ends, right?
Yeah.
And 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 that's interesting. If there were no ultimate accountability, how do you define the purpose of life?
I don't think there is. I think purpose is something that thinking minds give. And the example I'll use is, I could have a blender, right? The
Hmm.
blender doesn't have a purpose. If I put it on my desk as a paperweight, its purpose is to be a paperweight. If I make food with it, it's to make food with it. If I crush it up into a ball and scatter it on my lawn as art, I'm the one giving it purpose. So I don't think there's a purpose to life. I think we give purpose to ourselves and to other people.
Where do we get purpose from?
I think we create it. Like I said, it's a brick can be a paperweight or it can be a part of my house, but the purpose is something I've given it. It's not inherent to the brick. It's something I created by thinking.
Do things exist before we were born?
Uh,
Ideas, like one,
Oh,
two trees, or stuff like that. Does that idea exist before we're born?
only in other people's minds. I think thoughts only exist in minds and brains. So if there were, people before me, thoughts existed in their brains. But I'm not a platonic person who thinks that like thoughts or ideas exist external from the mind. I know some people are.
Oh, okay. So let's say before humans were created, right? Well, okay. So this would lead me down the line of how do you think everything came into existence?
Yeah, I mean, I just tend to accept the current scientific explanations. I mean, we can talk about abiogenesis or the formation of planets, but I'm not, a biologist and I'm not a cosmologist, so I would just defer to current science.
Current science, the furthest back. I guess science's best explanation right now is a theory, which would be the Big Bang, right?
Yeah, yes. The Big Bang is interesting. So there's a lot of like, do you know? I won't go off to the name of it. The Big Bang was someone who was derogatory towards the theory and called it the Big Bang. That tells you something. But yeah, I have no problem with there was an expansion of the known universe into something expanding outward. It cooled, planets were formed. Whatever the explanation is, it doesn't really affect me day to day, if that makes sense. Like if I found out tomorrow that it turns out that the big crunch, like maybe there's, the universe has been expanding, it contracts. That's not the current best theory, but if it did turn out to be true and we're just in a cycle of expansion and creation, it's not going to change much for what I do tomorrow morning for breakfast. So I don't tend to worry about it too much.
It could, because here's the thing, because you say you're a naturalist and we're just thinking brains and we assign purpose to ourselves. Then how do we assign jail to someone who assigns murder to themselves as their purpose?
I would say we have laws. I mean, as thinking creatures, we've made laws and punishments because it's hard to live in a society if our neighbors are stabbing us with no consequences. So
Right.
I just think we've made laws for ourselves, kind of like wild animals. I mean, if you've ever, talk about like, I know this isn't the common theory, but like alphas or like how packs control behavior in whether it's chimpanzees or wolves, like there's usually some kind of order that has to exist for living creatures to live near each other, at least among like mammals. I'm not talking, I mean, even insects and stuff, but again, I'm not a biologist.
Right. That's pretty interesting. Did you say some kind of order? So would you agree that as a society it's important to have order, and if it's important to have order, where do you think we get that from?
Trial and error, honestly.
YouTube
Emotion.
Premium is ad-free YouTube
Oh.
and the YouTube Music app.
Sorry about that.
That's all good. Those ads sneak in. I hear you. No, I think it's trial and error. I think a lot of it's emotion based and kind of tribalism. I mean, how many times is there like a family patriarch, or a matriarch in a family that kind of runs things and everyone kind of goes to it for advice? I think it's natural. Older people instruct younger people. Younger people have new ideas. Older people disagree. I just think it's mostly trial and error.
Trial and error.
Here's something that I guess I'm not. If you could help me make the connection, because you say we just kind of came up with laws as a progression of time, like we just got better. Naturally speaking, would you say humans are self-seeking things? Like they look for things to basically make their selves or their lives better?
Yeah, I think like most animals, we want more food, more shelter, more control, more prosperity. So, and our brains are pattern seeking, right? We see, like, I don't know about you, but in a dark room, you might see like a scary face or something. It turns out it's just like the curtains. So yeah, I think we're pattern seeking, and I think like most creatures, we do want to improve our situations.
Yeah. So it's go ahead. Eddie.
No. If you had a direct follow up, go ahead and do that, and then I'll go ahead and come with the next one.
Okay, so if at the end of the day, if it boils down to we do what's best for ourselves at the end of the day, how can someone come up with a law or a set of laws that applies to other people, so we make sure that other people, what they're seeking is also in their best interest but doesn't infringe on someone else? Why would I, who's seeking power and prosperity for myself, care for that homeless person on the street to be hit by a car if it doesn't affect me at all?
Oh, it's a great question. It seems to be that we have empathy. It seems to be built into us. And the example I'll give is, if I have to like crush a spider or a cockroach or something, maybe I try to get it outside, but if I crush it, I don't feel that bad. But if I had to crush a puppy, like I'm going to feel way worse. But why is that? Like they're both living things, right? But for some reason I have a connection to other mammals, especially, right? So it seems to be that there's something about us that we tend to care for cute little furry things or people who are closer to us. And the example I'll give real quick is there's this sort of brutally honest thing, which is if someone dies in your family, you can feel terrible. If your friend dies, you can feel horrible. But if you hear that 1,000 people died in a country you don't know in an earthquake, you're not going to mourn 1,000 times harder than you would for your friend, right? And so we have a disconnect. We have empathy, but it falls off the further away that person is, and then the bigger the numbers get. Because how can you feel bad for 1,000 people dying when if your father or lover or child died, it would destroy you emotionally? Why don't we feel that same way? Because our empathy has a cutoff. We couldn't function if we felt the pain and suffering of everybody equally. So I think that's part of it.
So if you compare us to monkeys, we're just better creatures.
Yeah. I don't say better because I think sometimes people think evolution is like you're improving towards a goal. We have a different set of tools. I mean, let's be honest, with all that's going on in the world, are there some monkeys that might be happier than people right now? Probably. I'm not going to, and I'm kind of like joking, but not joking. Like, as someone who suffered from depression and anxiety, like, there are days when I've been like in a horrible state of mind, really not loving life because of a job or an assignment. There are probably some animals out there having a much better time than I am. So like there's a burden to how we evolved in terms of like anxiety, pressures, mental suffering that I think other animals don't go through. But we get Netflix, so maybe it balances out.
Yeah.
You just made me think about something, and it actually related to the question that I was going to ask before when D was talking. Speaking of purpose and speaking of things having purpose, we see when we look and observe life outside the house, whether we're talking about trees, the sun, animals, we can see particular animals do particular things. Why don't the horse do the same or act the same way as a lion? Why doesn't the sun do exactly the same thing as the moon? Why is the moon cooler than the sun? Like, so we see all these things that we can observe and see its purpose because they have purpose in particular to a certain aspect of life. Why can we see those and not look at it as, okay, they have purpose, but where is the purpose from?
Yeah, and stop me if I'm getting your question wrong. Have you ever heard of the, I think it's called like the puddle paradox or something like that? There's an idea, right? Like, so if you see a puddle that's shaped a certain way, you're like, hey, maybe it's shaped like a crescent moon. Let's just say that, for example, or something. You go, wow, that's really interesting. You don't say the hole must have been designed to form the puddle in that way. You go, no, water filled a hole that already existed, but it looks like something, right? So for us, we've evolved on a world where life is possible and the laws of nature seem to be pretty consistent. So if there's going to be life here, everything's going to seem to have a purpose because life evolved here. But what I would say is, for example, we don't look at the moon and go, why isn't there life there? Because we know there's no atmosphere, right? We don't look at Mars. We look at Mars, hope maybe there was life there once, but like Jupiter, a gas planet, we don't say, why aren't there trees? Why can't we see water there? Because the environment is so different. So I would say that we expect to see order and life-giving properties on this planet because life is possible. So it's more about the puddle formed in the hole that existed. Like fish can only exist in ponds that can support fish. we don't expect fish to be in like salty water where they couldn't live. So for me, that's why everything seems designed for us, is because we're part of this ecosystem that's very unique.
So your perspective is it is that because that's how it is.
Yeah, in some way, because it's like, because life's possible here, we're going to see everything as if it's designed to create life. But if we were on the moon, we don't expect it because we know life can't exist there as we know it. So any place there's life, it's going to seem like everything's designed for it because, well, that's where life can be. Another example, and I'll try to be short, is if, like, some people say the universe is designed for life, right? And that might be a sign of a designer. But if I told you there's a motel and you can has 100 rooms, and only one of them, if you go in, you can have a good night's sleep. If you go into any of their other 99, you will die. You wouldn't say that hotel is designed for life. Oh, that's the buzzer. You wouldn't say that hotel is designed. Yeah, you wouldn't say the hotel is designed for life, right? In the same way, the rest of our universe doesn't seem designed to support life. The other planets don't. So I don't think it's a good argument from design, if that makes sense.
Okay. Wow. I mean that the first question was robust. I mean, we kind of went a little bit toward another part, which is not bad, but given the second question, in relation to the first question, right? Given your view of the afterlife, do you believe objective good and evil exists? Because if there were a place that is distinct for those two types of people to go to, it, like, what do you believe? So is there good and evil that we can observe here and now on Earth?
I only think so in terms of the definition. We could say, the Holocaust is evil. Hurting a child is evil. It's good to help your neighbor. It's good to better society. But for me, those are just words that define a goal. So I think they exist. I think we can use those terms. We just have to both be on the same page about what they mean. I don't think objective good and evil exists like natural laws, like gravity, or in a supernatural sense.
Okay, so
they're essentially opinions that the mass agrees to.
Kind of. I won't say it has to be agreement. I think you can look through history and say that people have agreed that some things were very good in the past that we now find morally reprehensible. I think it's more that morality, like physics or art or cooking or building, is something we've gotten better at through trial and error. So I think we've improved our morality over time. I mean, think about it this way. If you go back 1,000 years, were people arguing about whether to eat meat or eat a vegetarian diet because it's less cruel to the animals? There may have been some, but it wasn't as widespread as it is now. It seems like there's a big push to be like, we don't have to kill animals if we could sustain ourselves off of plants. And that's a moral argument that is a more developed one, but it took a lot of time and effort and, frankly, technology to even really get to the point where we could have that conversation. So I think morality has improved over time, just like philosophy and other human endeavors.
So morality can improve. So nothing is essentially, if everything can improve, then everything we believe now is wrong. It's going to be wrong at some point.
Maybe it could be wrong. I mean, I think, like if you look back to some of the, like we talk about the Bible, for example, I mean, you could say something like turn the other cheek or love your neighbors. That may turn out to be true forever. That's a good idea to love your neighbors. But I also know that there's things such as, treatment of women or slavery that we go, it may have been acceptable in a part of the world more or less, but now we go, that's a bad idea. So some things may always be true, and maybe that's why a lot of faiths have similar sayings that we all tend to connect with.
So you're not talking about objective morality; you're talking about subjective
morality.
Oh yeah, I don't think objective morality exists. I'm a pure subjective morality person through and through. I will say though, I think we can talk objectively about morality if we agree on certain points. And a great example I heard was like, there's nothing objectively true that says you should pay your water bill. After all, if you're no longer living there, you should not pay your water bill. But if you want water at your house, it's objectively true you should pay your water bill because that's how you get water to your house. So if we say we want a healthy, thriving society of freedom, objectively we should do certain things, but that's different than like the idea of an objective morality, a permanent good and evil established by a lawgiver. That's not what I believe in.
Okay, so if morality is subjective, what makes something truly wrong? You would say?
I'll avoid saying truly because I think we can just talk about right or wrong. I think it's a couple things. For example, culture. I mean, there's certain things in the way you grow up where things are seen as right or wrong, and you get it from your parents or your community, and that informs you. Then maybe you change your mind on these things, and you go, "Hey, I don't know if you were both parents or not, but I grew up. My dad spanked me." But there's been a big movement to get away from like spanking children because it's a short-term solution, but there could be long-term effects of anger or rage or a feeling of it's okay to do this to other people. And I'm not an expert. I'm not a father, so I don't want to speak to this. But that's an example of how I grew up. My family thought some things were okay, but a lot of my friends who have kids no longer partake in that. They're like, we've drawn a line. We don't think the evidence shows that this is a good thing to do. So I think culture, personal experience, all the normal things that inform us.
Okay, so that's interesting. So do you think that? So do you believe that humans have moral obligations or just preferences? You would say.
I don't think they have inherent moral obligations, but I will say, if you are in a relationship, for example, there may be inherent obligations to take care of your partner. I mean, I think, marriage vows become an obligation that you've stated and agreed to. Now, whether we're talking about legal or interpersonal, I think moral obligations can exist, but I think, either someone puts them on you or you put them on yourself. I don't think they exist outside of the mind.
Gotcha.
Okay, so this ties back to initially when you said in the first question that essentially we develop to become better humans, essentially at some point creating laws and such. If everyone has a subjective understanding of what is good and bad to them, how in the world do you come up with laws that protect the country and everyone follows it?
Well, I think history shows that it's difficult. I don't think everyone does follow them. I mean, people disagree with laws, sometimes rightly. I mean, the U.S. was, in part, America was, there was a taxation on tea, and there was a revolution against a king who legally and lawfully, had colonies here in the States or in the continent. But they threw that off because they disagreed with the laws. They disagreed with the taxation. So I don't think there's ever been a time when someone's gotten it perfectly and everybody agrees, especially as a nation or a group or a city encounter new people or people go away and they're not as close to the source of power. I don't think it's possible. I think we'll always have disagreements.
I'm not even talking about perfectly, because of course there's still people that go around killing other people in every single society that you go to. But generally en masse, most people don't go to their neighbor's house and just end their lives, right?
Yeah.
How come it is all subjective, yet at the same time, most people have the same indicator that this is bad? If it is subjective, then how is it generally a possibility?
Sure. I think because there are some objective truths, like if I get stabbed, it hurts. Generally speaking, let's take out people who, for some reason, interpret pain as pleasure. I feel bad, because there are people like that, right? There's
yeah.
But but for example, I have empathy. I think most people have empathy. Again, excluding psychopaths or others who may not. So I can imagine my neighbor suffering, and if they're in pain, I feel bad. Well, I don't want to feel bad. If I can help my neighbor and they stop crying, I'm going to feel better. So I think a lot of it's based on just our emotions, our feelings, but also practical things like, you can't have a society if a bunch of people keep stabbing each other, no one's going to stay together and it'll fail. So
who cares?
Those are the two.
It's going to make me prosper. Why should I care?
Well, that's two things. I mean, I think it's because, as I said, we're very similar. And so society's not going to work if we're all being terribly cruel to each other. But at the same time, there have been societies where that's happened, and do they last, or do they destroy themselves? And as far as I can see, it seems like empathy and reason keeps communities together. And that's also in self-interest, by the way, because remember, if you want a community, you want someplace safe. If people are running around the street stabbing each other, are you going to feel safe there? Or are you going to move to some place where they're not doing that? So I think it kind of self-regulates to a degree, but then you can look at like North Korea or other dictatorships where people suffered terribly under the government and from each other. And with enough resources, power, you can make that last a long time. So
Interesting. So, from all you said, so what would you, what's the standard that you would use to judge it? What's the standard that you would use to judge it?
Sure. In general, if I have to talk about morality, it's is something improving the well-being of someone or something is probably the main thing. Now, well-being can be subjective, but is it improving happiness, health, personal well-being, and minimizing harm and suffering? That's my go-to question when we talk about morality for most things. But again, depends on the subject.
So if someone's suffering, but if I were to stop them from suffering, it might cause them more suffering momentarily. Should I not stop them?
I think I would need a better example. Like if someone's running, like obviously I've been jogging for a while. Jogging sucks. I suffer every time I jog, but I'm doing it for self-improvement. So suffering isn't bad inherently, but I would say maybe I should have said unnecessary suffering. If someone's getting, kicked on the street, I would feel more obligation to stop them from being beaten by and large. If someone's just training for a marathon, I'm not going to tackle them because they hate running, right?
Yeah. Or like, if somebody gets shot, like on the movies where you have to hold pressure, but the pressure point where you're holding the pressure is a lot of pain.
Yeah.
But if you don't hold the pressure, they're going to bleed out.
Exactly. Yeah. And my wife is a lawyer, and she talked about some really interesting things about, in this case, like in hospitals where you may be restrained. Like, is it right to restrain someone? Well, what if they are going to get out of bed and fall? But restraining them is removing their freedom, even if they're in a state that they could hurt themselves. And it's a complicated thing. There's no easy answer, but these kind of things exist. And it's hard to always come to a clear consensus about what's right and wrong.
Go ahead.
And that's interesting that you say, constraint and having some kind of boundary to keep someone within so that they won't hurt themselves or that they won't go someplace. So, it just makes me think of from what you said, it sounds like you would believe that having certain constraints or borders is very useful and helpful to people.
Yeah, I think so. Don't steal. Don't, when you're little, don't take that candy. That's stealing. That's wrong. Or don't drive 500 miles on the freeway. Do 60. Yeah, I think those are useful at times.
Okay.
So then empathy would be a bad standard of measurement then. Because if I feel bad for the person that I have to tie down in the hospital because I'm being empathetic toward them, my empathy would be wrong in that moment.
Not wrong. It would just be painful, I think. I like, did you guys ever read Old Yeller, that book about the dogs? Like, if a dog is dying and there's no saving it, it's in pain, you may feel horrible about killing the dog, but you're ending its suffering. And I also, I'll speak personally. When I was younger, a good friend of mine developed bone cancer at a very young age. He was a very young man. And there was, near the end, a period of a lot of suffering that didn't have a lot of value. Watching someone die slowly in agonizing pain where even morphine won't help over days or weeks, there was no value in that, right? If I could have, flipped a switch and ended his suffering, I would have had to consider that because there were no more good days. And so I think our empathy, and I've seen this with other people whose family members, especially parents, may be getting older, it's really hard to think about care or end of life things because our empathy is we have the memories of them. We want them. We want that one last moment with them. Empathy is awful, but we have to deal with it, and I think it has benefits. But man, it's hard, So
Empathizing can be good as well, right? Isn't that the reason why we want the best for our kids? Because we may have been through some bad situations, and we know that them experiencing these good things is good.
Yeah, I don't think empathy is good or bad. It just is, but it informs us because empathy can be bad. I mean, after all, if you have a friend who is just on a bad path, is maybe always asking for money or, can't seem to get their life together, sometimes helping them too much doesn't get them on the right path. Empathy, if every time someone came by your house and said, "Hey, I really need money," how far do you give them money before you start impacting, your life, the well-being of your family, financial resources? We can't be an endless source of empathy, but doesn't mean we don't feel it. I think it's very useful, but it does make life hard.
That brings up the point that if empathy just is, then surely minds could not just have envisioned empathy on their own. It has to come from somewhere. And if empathy is good and bad, meaning it depends on the situation, but then at some point human beings came to be, are you saying it's possible that humans came to be and at the same time empathy came to be because of human beings? To me, it's kind of like going back and forth. It's like picking and choosing when to believe in something versus when not to.
Yeah, I'd say empathy predates humans. I think I have no problem being one of the great apes. I think if you look at apes in the wild, they show empathy. Mothers will protect their young. Animals will sacrifice themselves for the greater good. They'll throw themselves in front of predators, but they can also be selfish. But I think there was empathy before our species existed. I think we inherited it along with other problems. Like we talked about, like fight or flight. If you've had that moment where a gunshot goes off or something happens and you feel like you have to run or you have to start swinging your fist, that's not always, that can be useful, but oftentimes that gets us in trouble. So I would just say that we're the product of our simian ancestry and we got some good stuff, but we also inherited a lot of things that make life complicated.
All right.
Cool. All right. So I'm taking the next question. And the next question is going to be, are there any Bible teachings you believe are true? And how do you determine that they're true?
Yeah, so I came up with 3 examples. I'll just go through them real quick so I'm not monologuing. I think there was a historical Jesus, right? I think there was a real person named Jesus or whatever the Aramaic would have been that was an end-time preacher around the cities around Jerusalem. I think he gathered a following. I think he ran afoul of Roman law and was crucified, and a following grew up past him, right? I'm not a mythicist. I think that's a real person. The reasons is because in my mind, there's actually so many problems with some of the gospel stories and the historicity that if you were making someone up whole cloth, you wouldn't have those problems, right? And so I think it was a real person. Another example is I don't think the Exodus is real. I don't think there was ever, a million slaves, between 1 and 2.5, I think, Hebrew slaves that left. I don't think the plagues happened. So that's something I don't take as historical because it's not backed up by historical evidence to my mind. You won't find an example of when it actually happened in most like textbooks on the history of Egypt. And I think there's lots of problems with it from a historical standpoint, but there is evidence of Semitic names in Egypt around, prior to that. So I think there were Semitic people living in Egypt that eventually left, but this is a story that came later, and I don't think it's historical. And then lastly, something I think is historical that we have evidence for is there's a Moabite, we're holding off the Israelite. It was an attack on Kir Hareseth in 2 Kings 3, right? And the Bible talks about this, and the story for the Bible is that the king of the city sacrificed his son, and a great divine wind came, and the Israelites were pushed back. They didn't conquer the city. Well, there's a stele that talks about this from the Moabite perspective, and it's called the Mesha stele. And it talks about this same battle from the Moabites' point of view. So to me, that means, yes, this was a historical battle. There's two different views of how it turned out and why, but I accept that it happened because we have good evidence for it, from the Bible, but also from this artifact.
Okay. Did you ever get to meet your great-grandfather?
My great-grandfather, no, I don't believe I ever did get to meet my great-grandfather. Or it would have been like when I was a baby, but yeah.
Okay. So what if someone in your family, say you did get to meet your great-grandmother, and she said, yeah, your great-grandfather at 30 years old, he inherited $1 million, or he won $1 million, so he made $1 million, whatever it is. He came into $1 million, and then
I'd love to hear this, by the way. I would love to find out I'm inheriting the money, but keep going.
and then he lost it at 31.
We want this scenario to be real.
Yeah.
And then he lost it at 31 years old. How inclined are you to believe your great-grandmother?
I mean, given this is a hypothetical, if I knew her to be a very truthful woman, I might be like, okay, people gain and lose fortunes all the time. I could believe that because I've heard stories of someone who's like on the streets, gets a lottery ticket, wins $1 million, and literally loses it in a year by giving it away. So I'm like, that could happen. I would tend to a believer if I thought she was an honest person.
Okay. So would you then say the Bible, because you said you believe in moral truths and there are also subjective moral truths. And so do you believe in the moral claims the Bible makes?
I mean, I don't know what you mean by that. I mean, they can make statements. I may agree with some of them, but I don't know if I always believe like some of the words attributed to Jesus. Did he actually say those, or were those written by authors later who were either inventing or just putting together different stories? So I don't know the truth of that, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes we can be more certain that someone said something because there may have been proclamations that were sent out, and then we have copies of those. Like we have corroborating evidence of what was said. But most of the time, I think they probably made things up to some degree.
Okay, so initially you gave the example with your great-grandmother based on her character and based on the fact that things happen today, similar to maybe how your great-grandfather may have lost that $1 million.
Sure.
You can conclude that the truth may be, yeah, it is actually possible that he came into $1 million and then he lost it. Using those same standards, why would you not believe the things that you say you don't believe about Jesus Christ if you understand the character of him? And there is historical pieces, at least to some of the things that he did. So you understand his character based on what they wrote, and then you understand their historical evidences. Why then would you say that I actually don't know if what they wrote about his character is true?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So my standard tends to be I have a higher standard for supernatural claims. And so maybe the difference is if my grandmother said, hey, your grandfather made $1 million, but an angel came and took it away from him, it's the angel part that I would get stuck on, right? And so when I look at when I look at different stories, whether it's modern day, like, Mormonism, which seems to be riffing on Christianity or Islam, or I look at, Judaism, or even back, Roman emperors who claim divine heritage, it's the divine part, the miracle claims, that I just give more skepticism towards because I haven't really experienced them and they don't seem that common. And it seems like sometimes there was a trend of this is how people wrote certain things. So that's where I tend to get more caught up on is the supernatural aspect.
Interesting. I just thought of something because yes, we do see parts in the Bible where somebody is met by an angel, and that have experienced that by themselves, like whether they had a dream or whether they had an encounter. But, what makes me think about your statement is when you remember when Jesus was at the wedding with his mother and you had all these people at the wedding and they were drinking the wine ran out. Jesus, that miracle that he did was turning the water into wine. There's so many people at the wedding, right? And that have tasted the wine. And the king at the time was like, hey, this is the best wine. Like, why? Like, usually people serve it at the end, but we're having this early. Like, wow, this is great. In your view, that's something that even though a lot of people experience the taste of the wine through that miracle, that is still like an issue point for you, even with all the witnesses at the wedding tasting the wine.
Yeah, because I think we have to first assume the story happened as described. I have no way of knowing if it did. Next, we have to go, is there a better explanation? Did the apostles or Jesus bring some extra wine and the story eventually was like, oh, they turned it into wine? There's just so many variables there that, to me, I don't think I'm going to accept that a miracle happened just because I know so little about this. And in the same way that if I heard the same story that happened 20 years ago, even if the people, they had photos and stuff like that, I still would doubt a miracle happened, right? There's just better explanations. So when we go that far back, I'm not inclined to accept it because after all, I could ask, well, what was the name of any of the guests? And nobody knows, right? Because they weren't recording that kind of stuff. So it's hard for me to know if that even really happened or if it happened the way it's described.
Okay. Do you believe in documented medical miracles?
Yes, in the sense of like miracle being something unexplained. I've looked into things like, people who claim to have, had a limb restored or, levitated above their table in near-death experiences.
Right.
But a lot of times, to be very honest, I'd like to think that all medical examiners and all medical people were the highest quality investigators around. But after experiencing the medical system, at least in the United States, I know that's not the case. So I can believe in miracles, but I just say they're unexplained. That's as far as I've gone so far.
Isn't that what it is, though? Unexplained events to the naturalist?
So for me, as a naturalist, a miracle is just something that's either unexplained or highly unlikely. Like we might say winning the lottery is a miracle because it's so unlikely. But for me, I still think there'll be a natural explanation at the end, even if we don't understand it. It's not supernatural. So that's the only difference, right? Like I think at the end of the day, anything, the ghost in the walls is just your pipes banging because the water pressure is bad. So, a medical miracle is something medicine can't explain, but there was a materialistic explanation, even if we don't know it.
Interesting. So you could basically explain everything away then. There's nothing that's unexplainable, essentially. At the end of, even if we don't know it now, we'll find out at some point.
Possibly. I do give the caveat that, I'm not I don't know much about physics, but there may be just like quantum weirdness. There may be some aspect of the universe like black holes or how the universe started that we never get an answer to. We're like, there's a boundary that we'll never get past just because that's the way it worked out and life isn't fair. And I'm also open to miracles. Like, don't get me wrong. I think most miracles aren't real. But if someone said, hey, I'm going to levitate this gold brick and pass it to you, and you can, like, that could be a miracle, right? Like, I'm open to the idea. I just haven't seen any good evidence of it yet.
Right.
Did you have a question, Eddie?
You can go ahead and then I'll go next.
Mine might be a little bit longer-winded.
So real quick, I just thought about this. You go to a magic show and they do a trick, right? Hey, the ball's right here, and then the ball's gone. But in the back of your mind, you think, the ball's probably behind his pocket, or he put it in he tucked it away somewhere, or it's in his sleeve. Like something happened where I missed the sighting of where it went.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be so? Would you categorize like a miracle as something to be explained like that, or no, or not so much?
It depends. Like, I think there are people who do that kind of trickery and they don't tell the audience, I'm a magician, just so you know this is fake. There was, do you remember a guy named Peter Popoff? Does that ring a bell for you?
Popoff
Peter
does.
Popoff, yeah.
Yeah, he was a preacher and he was doing those like faith healings and swinging coats around and slapping people on the head. But he would call out to the audience and be like, Mary, like you're here, like your leg is ill. And people thought it was a miracle. Turns out they were putting things in. He was on a speaker in his ear, right? It was fake, right? So I do think there could be a lot of these stories from the Bible or other miracles that are actual deliberate deceptions. That is possible.
Wow.
Because I think even Jesus talks about like he says like after my death there'll be imposters, there'll be miracle workers who are not real. I think there's always been a sense in the Bible and prophet, around prophecy and things like that. There's always been fake miracle workers, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if some of those got into the stories, and we can talk about that later. But yeah, I think there's a difference. Sometimes it's deliberate deception. Sometimes it's just something we haven't explained yet. Would be my two positions, generally speaking.
Okay. So if your criteria for deciding whether or not something is true in the Bible essentially is based on whether or not you want to believe it, because essentially you're saying that if something is supernatural, then your standards for judging it becomes way higher.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And not just for the Bible, right? Like there's stories of like, Roman emperors who say they were gods, or the Greek gods, or, Islam and the cracking of the moon. Like it's not just for the Bible. Anytime you have supernatural, my standards are just a little bit higher for needs of evidence.
For sure. So what category of expertise do you seek for things that are supernatural if the natural things are sought out by science?
Right. So that I think we'll touch on that in a later question. I don't tend to look for expertise in the supernatural because I found it very confusing. An example I'll give is I've seen a bunch of books on like the prophecies of Jesus, right? Did Jesus fulfill prophecies? But the numbers change depending who I'm talking to. Some books say 50, some say 350, some say that's only in the New Testament or the Synoptic Gospels. Some say like, it's hard to get an answer from like a theist or a religious organization on like, how do I prove or disprove a miracle claim? I've never gotten a good answer. And I don't want to put it on you guys, right? Because I don't want to derail this, but think about it. Like if you went to yourselves or your leaders and you said, hey, a miracle happened. What standard do we have that's consistent that lets us show a miracle is real or not? I don't know what answer you would get, but I've never found someone who would give me a good criteria for, looking at a real miracle versus a fake miracle, either in the past or in the future. So it's kind of confusing for an atheist to be like, how do I go to experts when they don't seem to have a set answer, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, because I don't think there's any kind of standard that could prove a miracle. There's none, because that's exactly what a miracle is. Something that happens in nature that is enforced by something outside of nature.
Right.
So there's no possible, but the conversation of a miracle can't be had with a scientist that only looks and tries to understand things in the physical, if that makes sense.
I'll push back a little bit, but I think I'll say this because I think at some point there's a question about what would convince me to be a theist. Okay. And I think there are some things that a scientist could look at that could prove miracles, but we'll get to that. If we want to move on, we can move on.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'll jump into the next question, which is, you've practiced the dark arts. The Dark Lord himself. Yes.
We have Gandalf's best friend here.
Yep.
What did you experience, and how do you explain those experiences within your worldview, if you experienced anything at all?
Yeah. So after leaving Christianity, I got into Wicca, which is, from my understanding, actually a much more modern day sort of like pagan practice. We kind of laughed when you first asked us about dark arts, because it's actually like, it tries to be a very ethical system. It's very diverse, so don't think I'm speaking for all Wiccans. I haven't practiced in 20 years, right? So I'm sure I'm out of touch. But I came up with 3 examples of things that when I was practicing this, I thought I was having like a supernatural experience, right? And I'll go through them really quickly if you want to follow up on any of them. And then I'd love to talk about why I no longer think they're supernatural. But one was, there was a New Age bookshop that I was visiting in the college town I was in. And I heard them say one day, like, during the week, they were like, hey, like money's tight because, sales aren't doing great. They were just usual small niche bookstore stuff, right? So I did a spell. And for those who don't know about Wicca, you basically imagine yourself gathering energy. You give kind of a rule for the energy to follow, such as, If I want money to come to the shop, it can't hurt anyone. It can't cause anyone to spend money that they wouldn't be willing to spend, and only if it would benefit them. There's this idea of rule, like the rule of three, that any good or bad energy you put out there can come back to you 3 times. So you want to try to be as moral as possible, right? So I did this spell.
That sounds like karma.
It is. There's a lot of overlap, right? Okay. So I did the spell, lit some candles, focused on this. And then, the next week I stopped in the shop and they were like, oh, we had a good weekend. A lot of people came in. It was very, it was a good weekend for us monetarily. Well, I was like, well, my spell helped with that, right? Like I thought I had accomplished something. The next example is one night I was working in a music hall late at night, closing up, and I decided just to sit in the darkened theater. And as I was settling in, I swear I could feel a presence, like a spirit watching me, right? And it was very unnerving and kind of spooky. And so after a while, I just said out loud, like, hey, I have no problem with you. I'm going to go. But it felt like, like a horror movie or something, or late at night when you think someone's in the house, that there was something watching me. And the third example is that after my mom passed, I was with her near the end. A couple days later, I had, got that morning, like turned off all the lights, left, come back from work, and I found the light in the kitchen on, which is one of her favorite places. And I was like, oh man, I wonder if that was, because they talk about spirits lingering or things like that. So those were 3 things that initially I thought were supernatural, right? Now, right. If I can go really quickly as to why I don't think those are now, because I think this is important. So when I was studying parapsychology, I started reading about cognitive bias, right? This idea that we think the outcome, if we want an outcome to happen, we tend to look for signs of that and we ignore other explanations. So first of all, bookshops are popular on the weekend. That's when people do most of their shopping, right? That's when they have sales. That's when people have time. So while I initially was like, oh, my spell helped them get some money into the bookshop, the truth is that if they were going to have a lot of income, it would be during the weekend. That's when small bookshops are most visited. So there was a better explanation than my spell. The hall, this idea of having a spirit, man, theater halls are designed to create acoustic, either quiet or to reinforce acoustic noise. So of course, a young man who's thinking about Wicca and spirits is sitting alone in the dark, and I felt like something was watching me. Man, we all feel that. How many times have we thought someone's in the house or something's in the room when it's dark and it's quiet? So I was looking for signs of spirit, and guess what? In the one place that tries to modify your sense of either sound or quiet, I thought something was watching me. That's a much better explanation than there was some random spirit in a hall. And finally, with my mom, the day later, I remembered because I left for work and then I forgot my phone, and I had rushed back because now I was running late, and I turned the light on in the kitchen to find it. But I didn't remember that when I came home that evening. My first thought was it was my mom's spirit because she loves the kitchen. And then I thought about it and was like, no, I forgot my phone this morning, and I rushed in and I forgot to turn the lights off. But I had forgotten that later in the day, right? When I was tired and thinking about my mom recently passing. So those are examples of 3 things that I would say were cognitive bias. I assumed, because I was Wiccan and interested in spirits, that there was a supernatural explanation. But in hindsight, I was like, there's probably a naturalistic explanation.
Okay. Eddie, do you have some before I ask?
Yeah. So I got a question about the second example with the, you heard something in the, theater room. So what'd you do after you heard that? You hear something roll? What was that?
It wasn't anything like that. It was more of like just a feeling of being watched, and
okay.
Yeah, like it's that kind of thing. Like if you're in the woods alone at night and you think something's watching you, or you think someone's in the house. It wasn't so much that I heard things rolling around. I just got spooked, and I interpreted that as a spirit, in the room, and I was like, hey, no problems, I'll leave. But again, I think it was just I had the willies because it's a dark, spooky theater,
Yeah, and so going to your your Wicca experience, you said you did a couple spells. Would you call that like white magic spells or friendly spells?
Yeah, it's the one thing I do like about the Wicca thing is you are kind of held responsible for the outcome. I think within Christianity or some, you ask God or, a saint or whatever it is to sort of like help you out however they think is best. But in Wicca, you're expected to like think about the energy you put in the world so it doesn't harm anyone. It, you know, it's, you got to go through the list of things and try to think about ways this could backfire. You know, and it's like the monkey paw thing, right? Where, you know, you get a wish and you're like, I wish for $1 million, and then a briefcase weighing 5 tons lands on your head, right? So there's this idea of like, be responsible. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So within Wicca and a lot of like that kind of spell casting, you are expected to, you know, have a sense of morality, but also think about how this could go badly and do your damnedest to make sure that like the energy you put out doesn't hurt anybody.
So have you because I hear a lot of different experiences when it comes to magic, white magic, dark. Do you know anyone, or at the time when you were doing this, that did dark magic, the dark arts, anything like sinister? Any experiences on those end?
Not in my group. I mean, you hear stories and things like that, but a lot of it was like reading about things, and a lot of it was, I would say, more fan fiction than anything. You know how there's those end of time Christian books that come out? Like, there's a whole series of them about the end times. I forget the name of them, but they're really popular, right? Like, people don't take those literally, even if they think that may be how things play out. There's a lot of stories and books and that talked about like dark magic or like the magic wars. I give that a lot of like, I think this was mostly fan fiction. Are there people out there trying to do magic with ill intent? Sure. In the same way that someone may pray to God or say, be like, you know, I hate this person so much, strike them dead. I don't think it actually has any effect because, again, I'm a naturalistic atheist, but I'm sure they're out there. But I never encountered them myself.
Interesting. There's a lot of testimonials, so to say, and evidence of people on even YouTube that tell their story of they were practicing these kind of magic things, doing rituals, and at some point things got so intense that, you know, they were feeling presence in the house. They were feeling people touching them and no one was there. Doors were opening and closing, electricity lights coming on and off, whispers in the dark, waking up at the same time at night every day. With certainty, are you able to say that all of it can be explained away?
Well, so I'm not going to say with certainty because I wasn't there. Like I can't have 100% knowledge of anything. But if you said, hey, do you think this was real? I'd be like, no, I think they were working themselves up into a state, and I think there's a naturalistic explanation. Now, if you say, well, can you be 100% certain? Only in the sense that I'm a naturalistic atheist and I'm certain. But again, if you brought me to their house and you're like, look, the chair is levitating, I'm open to that, man. But, you know, it's one of those things, like the example I give is like, am I 100% certain that Jeff Bezos is not riding a horse in my backyard? Yes, I am certain. Have I looked at my backyard since I started this conversation? No. So it's like certainty. I'm certain as much as I can be that those were not real experiences. I think they experienced them, but I don't think it was supernatural. But I'm open to being wrong.
So to pivot a little bit here, if you don't have 100% certainty of everything because you can't be everywhere at the same time, then how are you so certain God doesn't exist?
Oh, sure. That's a great question. So for me, it's the man-made nature of the books of the Old Testament and the New leads me to believe that this was man-made.
But wait a second. If you weren't there, how do you know it's man-made?
That's another great question. So if we had, and this is the way I approach it, if there was a God who wanted like a book to be laid out, it would be perfect in the sense that like we would find no evidence of it being manipulated. You know, it would be consistent. There wouldn't be any mistakes, historical or otherwise, contradictions. And I would expect that we wouldn't see changing morality or changing views on the divine over the course of the book. But that is what I see when I read the Bible. I do see mistakes or contradictions or a changing view of prophecy or even what the divine is. So that's why I think it's not divinely inspired, because I think I'd see a different book if the claims of Christianity were true in terms of God's qualities.
Okay, so if everything can be to a certain point, if you were there and had enough evidence and understanding of what happened, everything can be explained away, right? Nothing essentially would be supernatural if we had the evidence for it.
No, I think there would be. Like I said, for example, if someone said, "Hey, I'm levitating a chair," and there's no natural explanation for why, assuming they're not tricking us, right? No strings, no magnets, but like if we went to a corpse, right, and you or someone else raised that corpse from the dead, and I'm talking like 10 years in the ground, I'm open to that being supernatural, my friend. There is no natural explanation for like a 10-year-old corpse, missing its organs to come back to life. So I think it's possible. I'm open to the idea. It's just I need it's a big standard of evidence. Like it's a big. You're gonna have to prove it pretty clearly to me.
Which that would have to be tied to a narrative, right? You don't, in history, from what I understand, you don't have people going around resurrecting 10-year bodies and then him just saying, all right, go and do whatever you want. There's always a narrative behind the thing being done.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think because they're stories, I think a lot of times they don't happen, and that's why the raising of the dead is more about the story than it being real, because it's meant to either fulfill something that happened later or to show that an event is very important. Right. I think there's one of the Gospels that talks about like when Jesus died, the dead rose afterwards in the city briefly. And there's no record of that, but it's a throwaway line. And you're like, wait, did the dead rise? Like where else is that mentioned? And it's not mentioned anywhere else. I think it's meant to show a fulfillment of prophecy or that this was an important event.
Right. Which at the end of the day, that kind of story doesn't really shake the perspective of a Christian, because like we just agreed upon, there has to be a story tied to it. So if Jesus rose from the dead and a whole bunch of people also rose from the dead in the city, does that fit the story and the narrative of the Christian worldview? Not really, because at the end of the day, the story is not about the other people rising. It's the accountability of Christ rising and people to show that, hey, he did rise. And when you have 500 individual over 500 individual accounts of him rising, it's really hard to say that there's not enough evidence. And so you would deny that, like, I don't know if all of those accounts are real. Then I would say that your position of being atheist has to switch to being agnostic, because you're essentially taking the position of, unless I know what happened, it didn't happen. Therefore, I am in a position of not to say God, but I am in a position of superiority because I am defining what happens and didn't happen. And if there's enough evidence, therefore, I am in a place of a God, which would kind of destroy your whole idea around subjective morality, because it's not really subjective when you come down to it. If you are saying that, I don't know if that actually happened, and you guys are basically living in delusion.
Well, I would put it this way. I don't know of any 500 witnesses that individually attested to a resurrection. I know that, I'm not sure if it's an Acts or not, where someone said something was witnessed by 500 people. But if I asked you, could you give me a list of those 500 people's names? They're not anywhere there, right? And in the same way, if I said, hey, my uncle levitated over the Grand Canyon, 50 years ago, 500 people saw him do it. Now, is my claim that 500 people saw him do it convincing to you? If it's not, in the same way that, someone writing a gospel that says over 500 people saw it, I'm not convinced. In the same way you probably aren't convinced if I just claim that 500 people saw my uncle levitate over the Grand Canyon, right? I need more than just a claim that a bunch of people saw something, because anybody can say that.
Okay, yeah. I think that's fair. And this kind of ties into this next question a little bit. Maybe we can expound a little bit. That given your skepticism, why do you care so much about the Bible and its scholarship then? Because you've made it clear in the past that it's something that you're getting more into, and it's very interesting.
Yeah. So two fronts. Personally, being raised Catholic light, we weren't super Catholic, we're Catholic light. I think there's always, if I don't know if either of you have ever left a religion or even left a church, or a group of people or any kind of thing like that, even if you have good reasons for leaving, or you find yourself, falling out of love with someone, even after that, you're always kind of second guessing yourself, right? You're always wondering, well, should we have broken up? Was the organization right and I was wrong? I miss my friends, I miss my family. So as an atheist growing up in a, kind of, loosely Christian household, but with, talk about God and Jesus everywhere in America, there's always that like voice in the back of your head that might be like, could it be true? Could it not? Are you just being an angry atheist who's arguing for the sake of arguing and making the other person mad? And when I started looking into scholarship, those kind of like, the scales fell from my eyes, if you don't mind me using a bit of scripture there. But really, it put to rest a lot of things, because the more I looked at it, the more I saw that a lot of what Christians think about the Bible or prophecies is based more on dogma in terms of like what Christians now think about it versus what the audience at the time, what the authors were intending. And the more I learned about how authors were writing for the audience at the time about concerns that were close to their hearts, it made me realize that this isn't divinely inspired. I saw much more of prophecies being changed or trying to explain away a nation's lack of standing. If you look at Isaiah, if you look at Jeremiah, this sense of Israel is always suffering, right? Why is it if they have the best God or the God, depending on, the point in history, why are they always suffering? And that's a powerful dilemma, I think, to face. And I think it's something, as a Christian, as a white male Christian, growing up when I was younger, we don't think about how hard life can be, right? So imagine a small nation like Israel, always suffering at the hands of larger nations. A lot of what they were trying to figure out was, why are we always getting the short end of the stick? And wanting a sense of either revenge or closure and not getting it. And the more I saw these themes, and then how later Jews and Christians had taken those themes and reinvented them to explain, Christ or the church, it made me go, yeah, this is a book of man-made ideas, because it's being renegotiated century after century so that it makes sense to the people of the time. And I was like, it took the fear away from me, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And lastly, I like talking about it because, again, I'm not really trying to deconvert you guys or anyone else. If there's anything I can do is to talk about scholarship, is to say there's a rich understanding of a lot of the Old Testament, especially as you look into like scholarship, because they try to say, we're not necessarily going to do this in view of Christians. We have to say, what was the view of this author at this time and what did it mean to them? And I think that will expand Christian thought and appreciation for some of the verses.
Yeah, for sure. So what it sounds like to me is you're saying that when you go back and look at how these different chapters and books and canons of the Bible were written, they weren't actually written with divine influence.
Inspirations.
Right. They were written by the authors just because they could write it to help explain some of the things that were happening.
Yeah.
Okay. So then how do we get divine influence such as prophecies? How do you explain away prophecies in such a statement that you just made?
So I think there's a couple different types of prophecies. If we go from a naturalistic worldview, right? Let's set aside divine prophecies. One is, and I think it's Ezekiel that shows this, and we can talk about this, a prophecy against Tyre and Egypt. They're legit prophecies. They're like, hey, we think this thing is going to happen, and the author, put this prophecy in the mouth of God because they really thought it would happen, right? I think that's one type of genuine prophecy. Someone who says the end is coming, and on like you may have seen people who've been like, the end is coming in 2027, and it's a real prophecy. They've given a date, so that's possible, right? It may be right, it may be wrong, but it's a genuine prediction. Next is someone writing afterwards, where you say, oh, I'm writing a character that lived 200 years ago, and I'm putting what's for me history in the mouth of this character. So they're prophesizing, but I'm writing as if they're 200 years ago. So it's a story that is turning history into prophecy. I think that's the easiest way to do it, right? Because you already know what happened. And then lastly, I think there are times when there either may be genuine prophecy or something similar, and later editors, not the original authors, go back and change the text to make a prophecy work better, or to turn something that maybe wasn't a prophecy into a prophecy, if they make it vague enough. So I always give room for, editors that come hundreds of years later after the original authors modifying text. So I think those are the main things we see that would explain prophecy.
Interesting. So that's a pretty big allegation that what we see now in the Bible is different from the original text that we have.
Oh yeah, we know it is, and not in little ways, and also maybe some big ways. But we know things have been changed. I mean, I don't know if this blows your mind. Have you heard of the Masoretic text?
No.
So do you know the Septuagint?
Yes.
Right. So that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? But there was no unified Hebrew original collection of text, right? So the Masoretic text that we use, it's called Masoretic because it was the Masoretic sect of Judaism. I think they were monks or the equivalent, right? They were a group. They were doing their own translation and creation of the Hebrew text after the Septuagint. Which is wild, right? You're like, so now we have a problem where it's like the Septuagint is based off texts that those authors or those translators were working on, but we don't have those texts. The best we have is the Masoretic text, which came after the Septuagint. So it's messy. It's very messy. But I have some examples if we want to get into it, where I think we can clearly see authors changing prophecy when it fails in the Bible.
Okay.
Clear examples. And so that's part of why I'm it seems not real to me. It seems like a natural explanation is better.
Did you have a question, Eddie?
Oh no.
Okay. So
were you gonna actually go ahead?
Okay. So the question of this is, given your skepticism, why do you care so much about the Bible and its scholarship? It's to point back to that doubt in your mind that, is this actually real? So you're actually trying to debunk the Bible in a sense. I'm not saying that's what you're set out to do, but essentially that's what you're finding out is the Bible, which what you were raised on, might not actually be true because there are these things that are changed in the Bible.
Not really. I would phrase it this way. I fell out of Christianity because eventually I didn't feel it was true. I wasn't studying it like I am now. The recent view of scholarship, I would say, more has put to rest any lingering doubts. But it wasn't the cause of me leaving Christianity. I think that was just a natural young man's going, I don't think I believe this anymore. I think I'm going through the motions. And that's why I explored, parapsychology, Wicca, and a few other things. This study of scholarship came much later in life when I was, again, not a Christian, but as I said, help put to rest lingering doubts.
Curious question, because I definitely hear that to be a common thing with a lot of people that kind of go away. So my question in regards to you leaving Christianity, were there any prominent reasons or things that you experienced that made you go away? What was it that really pushed you away from it?
This is a boring answer. There wasn't really anything. I mean, like I said, we were Catholic light. We would go to church on the big holidays, but really over time, I just, I didn't have an interest in it. And, remember, this is a time when, there was a stronger movement for lesbian, gay, bisexual people coming out. I was in theater. And, it was also during a time when, what was that church that was always out there protesting the gays, using, the negative connotation? I won't say the word here, but God hates fill in the blank. And so I think there was just a lot of negative views of the church and Christianity because of the time and place I was at. And again, I wasn't tied to a big church community. I wasn't active in church. So for me, I just drifted out of it. There was no negative event. I wasn't hurt, abused. No one yelled at me. It was just a natural progression away from it.
Yeah. So, from what I'm hearing, being that you weren't involved as much, getting within the weeds of it, especially with other, believers, it was easier for you to drift off or even just leave it all together. So,
yeah.
So my question too is, did you or did you not? Well, it sounds like you didn't experience, I guess, people that really believed it and really lived it. Would you say that's the case for you? Like you didn't really experience that firsthand?
Yeah, I'll say this. I try not to judge who's living the Bible and who's not. What I kind of say is like my mom, when I asked her about religion sometimes, she would say, I talk to God while I'm doing the dishes. And I always thought that was a wonderful view of Christianity. Like she just had her time with God and she would talk with him about her day. And like, I think it's a very honest view of it. So I don't, I know there have been people who grew up in like evangelical churches or, were like preachers or participate in the choirs. I don't know if that would have changed my view of things. It probably would have, but that wasn't the kind of experience I had. But I can't say it was living or not living. That would be a little presumptuous of me, I think.
Okay.
Okay, so given your perspective, going back to the prophecy thing, the prophecies that have been changed in the Bible, and you can clearly see this in scholar. I mean, you've been studying the scholarship work for, I think, 8 to 10 months now.
Yes, yeah, 6, 8 months, somewhere in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're already finding all these big discrepancies between what the original text was and what actually happened in history. What makes you different from the people who have dedicated their lives to the same type of texts and yet come to the conclusion that there is evidence that shows that these things did happen, and indeed God who was directing Israel? Because here's the thing, you mentioned being a white male, having to do with your belief system and all of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you compared that to the Israelites back in their time always suffering at the hands of something that was going on in the society. Did I understand that properly?
Yeah, in the sense that like, as coming from a place of privilege, a middle-class white dude, when you when you read the Bible, sometimes you want to make it about you and your life, and you read the stories, and oftentimes preachers say, how does this apply to you in your life and what God wants for you? But when you start looking at it historically and you're like, this is a small little nation state that's getting bullied and conquered and really struggling to survive, that wasn't something that was talked about a lot in, my church experience. We never seemed to really stop and empathize and go, why were these prophecies here? Why did they expect God to come down and like destroy these other nations? It's because it was a small nation, a very tiny one. And they were having a really bad go of it. And that was not something that was generally covered. It was more about, what does God want from me? And if this passage is about what God wants me to do, and so little about, no, it was about their suffering. Why don't we talk about that? So that's what I meant by like, it was easy to overlook that from a place of privilege.
That's really interesting, because that would fall right in line with your naturalistic view, to where if this is what's happening with this nation, then surely this must have been what they were thinking. But what if it wasn't? Because you don't have any evidence for that. That's a conclusion you came to yourself. If this is happening, then this must be true.
I think the prophets talk about it. I think the prophets talk about like the suffering of Israel and their hopes for like vengeance on the other nations. I think that's a core teaching of the prophets. I think that's what they're all about. So I get that from that book is what I meant.
Gotcha. So, but that doesn't explain the actual events of their whole history, right? Because at some point, Israel becomes a huge nation.
Not really, no.
No point in time did they become a nation to where other nations were feeling threatened by how big they had become.
I mean, you might say that like in the modern day, but if you look at, for example, like, did Israel ever conquer Egypt? No. Did they get themselves out of exile? No. Cyrus came along and took out Babylon. Like there is a lot of cases where Israel as a military nation didn't really do a whole lot. Like there's stories about, small like city state fighting, but there is no history of Israel conquering Egypt, conquering Babylon. Like, yeah, it was a very small scale nation, surrounded by bigger powers. And I think that's the story of the prophets, and trying to figure out why God hasn't yet, redeemed them and punished these other nations.
Interesting. Okay. I will, yeah. Eddie, I think has a question.
Yeah. So actually, We're actually going to skip the next question because we've been talking about a lot about Bible prophecy, and that's kind of where the next question was going to. And I feel like we hit a lot of Bible prophecy, pinpoints.
Oh, I will say there's one I wanted to go over, but if we have time, because I don't want to leave saying that like I claim there's prophecies that change without giving an example. But please continue. I just hope I have time for like a few minutes for that near the end.
Okay, we can I'll give you 3 minutes here, and then
Sure.
and then you can go ahead and yeah. So go ahead and share those stats that you got on that one.
Sure. So if you look at Ezekiel 26 and 29, and we don't have to do this live right now because it's recorded and the audience can look at it. In Ezekiel 26 through 29, Ezekiel states that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is going to go into Tyre. He's going to break down the walls, break down the gates, and get all the treasure inside, because that's how he's getting paid, right? Because Tyre is a nation state, very on the sea, a seaport, lots of money in there, right? Well, that doesn't happen. A few verses later, Ezekiel tells us, God says through Ezekiel, hey, you have, your shoulders are bared, you've gone bald in your struggle, AKA you've tried really hard to get through the gates. So instead of getting paid here, the Lord is saying, go to Egypt and you'll get paid by taking over Egypt. That's a prophecy that changes. The prophecy originally was you're going to break in here, you're going to get the loot in Tyre, and you're going to get paid. But when that didn't happen, I think it was a real prophecy, right? I think early on the prophet said this because he thought there's no way the small nation state is going to stand up against Babylon. In the same way we think Russia, like there's no way Ukraine is going to stop Russia, right? But it happened. So later on, he changes the prophecy. He's like, hey, instead, go down to Egypt. That's how you're getting paid. But that is a prophecy being changed in real time in the story. And he also says, and when you're in Egypt, you're going to go in there, you're going to conquer. You're going to conquer so much that there is going to be nothing living in Egypt, in its major cities, for 40 years. And then after 40 years, God's going to come and call the Egyptians back, and Egypt will never again be a major power in this area. That also didn't happen. Nebuchadnezzar went for Egypt. The king was forewarned. They stopped him inside the border, and Nebuchadnezzar never conquered Egypt. It was never desolated for 40 years, and God never brought the Egyptians back. And Egypt, as you know, remained a massive power in that area. So this is the main thing I think that, and again, it's not like I'm the first one to notice this, right? Scholars have known this for a while. It's just most Christians don't talk about it because, in fact, I saw this on a Christian talk show. It was a YouTube channel where a Christian brought this up as an example of a failed prophecy. And his friends were really bothered because they were like, wait a second, Ezekiel is saying God said this. This is God speaking. And God says they're going to get paid by breaking down the walls and going in. But then God says, instead, that didn't happen. Go to Egypt. This is God speaking. How can that be wrong? And they were really bothered by it. So I'm not the first to notice. I just think some of these issues aren't brought up because it doesn't do a good job to tell people that, yeah, prophets change what God says is going to happen when things don't work out. So I'll leave it there. If we want to talk about it more, it's great, but you're free to check out the verses yourself. It's very plain speaking about this.
So quick, what's the reference to that again?
Sure. It's Ezekiel 26 and 29.
Okay, great. For those who want to go back and look.
Yep.
So let's move on to actually the last question.
Sure.
We're going to skip, like I said, the prophetic one because we kind of been hitting that. So no need to go back over there. So for the last one, D, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. The last question is, what would it take for you to believe that God is real?
So
And-
this is, oh yeah.
And before you answer that, just keep that in mind. I got a short video that I want to share on a couple of atheists, some who were converted and some still are at least thinking about some things, might be on the verge. But I just want to give you, in the audience, a couple examples of just some really stern examples from the Bible and why they kind of have a certain view on it in relation to what they now believe or what they still have, struggled with. So let me go ahead and share that really quick here.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will actually switch there we go right here. Okay. So let's check this out and then you can go ahead and answer the question.
Crucified by the Romans. and then people claimed to see him after he died, and were willing to be put to death for that belief. Now, okay, maybe he didn't die. Unlikely. As they say, the Romans knew how to
And just in case anyone missed it, he's talking about Jesus died and was killed by the Romans, just in case.
kill people. And supposedly, they check. And they go to break the legs of the other prisoners as they're taking them down from their crosses. They were taking them down sort of temporarily, and they hadn't died yet. But when they go to break Jesus' legs, they realize he's already dead, which is why his legs don't get broken. And they stab him in the side with a stick to make sure that he's dead. I mean, this was a very effective method of killing people, and they knew how to do it. So it's unlikely that he just somehow survived this.
Is that the guy that stabbed him with the spear and supposedly there's blood on the spear? Or was this?
Someone stabs him with a spear after he's on the cross, and it's essentially to check he's dead. Okay, so likelihood is that he was actually crucified, and then a few days later, people are claiming to see him. Maybe they're lying, but then you don't tend to go to death for something you know to be a lie. You're willing to be put to death for things that you think are true that are false. But very rarely are people willing to die for beliefs that they don't actually believe themselves. That doesn't really happen. So they probably weren't lying. As maybe they were mistaken.
Fooled.
Yeah. Now, I've known you since about 2019, which is probably, it will have been slightly longer than Jesus was with his disciples, but imagine spending every single day with this person, living with this person, eating with this person. And then you've only seen him a few days ago. And somehow, imagine somebody managed to convince you that they were me. Even if I had a twin brother, they probably wouldn't be able to convince you that it was me. Or maybe they were hallucinating in groups. One of the earliest gospel, New Testament sources is the letters of Paul, the earliest. And in one of those letters, Paul refers to Jesus having appeared to 500 people all at once. And in some of the Gospels, you get at least some group appearances, at least more than one person, and sometimes, groups of disciple, the 12, all seeing Jesus all at once. You don't get group hallucinations like that, and so it doesn't seem like they were mistaken either. And so if they're not mistaken, they're not making it up.
Why did you become religious?
I was persuaded of it. I was an atheist for 10 years, but that view just is not tenable.
What about it?
Well, it doesn't explain anything.
Why do you need things explained?
Because I'm a rational person.
But how does it not explain certain things? I feel like just by chance is an explanation, right?
How does the chance come about? How does anything come about? One could discuss chance and probability and, stochastic systems or whatever, but you can only do that within the context of a created world. At a certain point, you have to ask, well, how did all of that come about? And there are plenty of ways to do it. You can ask how anything is in motion. An object is in motion when some other object puts it in motion. Well, what happens when you go all the way back down the line? You need to have an unmoved mover. Causes. There has to be an uncaused cause, doesn't there? We all agree that it's better to help a little old lady cross the street than it is to kick a newborn baby in the head. Well, if some things are better than other things, then there has to be a maximally great thing. Who is that maximally great thing? That would be God.
It's interesting that one of the most famous atheist New Testament scholars, Gerd Ludemann, said, it is historically certain that Peter and the other disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ.
Wow.
That's the atheist talking. Well, why is he still an atheist? Because he believes these were visions. These were hallucinations. So I went to an expert on the human mind, and I laid out all the historical data, and I said, now, Dr. Collins, wouldn't you admit to me these disciples didn't encounter the resurrected Jesus? They just had hallucination. And he looked at me and said, that's not possible. I said, well, you seem pretty sure of yourself. He said, I am. And he said, you got to understand something about the nature of hallucinations. Hallucinations are like dreams. They happen in individual minds. They don't spread like the common cold. He looked at me and he said, Lee, the earliest account says that 500 people encountered the resurrected Jesus at one time. He said, Lee, 500 people having the same hallucination at the same time would be a bigger miracle than the resurrection.
So that was just a quick video of a couple perspectives there. So I thought that was pretty interesting to bring to the audience. But yeah, so as far as the question, what would it take for you to believe God is real?
Sure. So the one answer is, if I have a roadside visitation like Paul or Saul did, setting that aside, right? Like divine intervention, divine revelation. I thought about this and I was like, and this may sound boring, but statistics. So, I would ask a theist, like, do you think God answers prayers for Christians? And you might say yes, you might say no. But does God answer prayer for Muslims or for Hindus or Buddhists, right? Is God actively granting them the same benefits or supernatural positive interactions that Christians claim? Now, I think most Christians say no. Some might say God can help whoever he wants, but it would seem weird if God is answering prayers from Greeks, who believe in Zeus as much as he is from faithful Christians, right? So I think I would take that off the table, and that I don't think would be too controversial. So my question, I'd be like, if I saw that statistically miracles were happening to Christians but not other faiths, I'd be like, well, something's going on here, right? Because Christianity isn't genetic, right? You can be of any genetic line, any race, any creed, any gender. But then I think statistics would bear that out. And an example I'll give, and I forgot about this, but this is something that I remember being asked was, why won't God heal amputees? So, we hear about resurrections, we hear about miracles, people surviving cancer, surviving a fall, being lost in a tornado. But have you ever met someone who said, hey, I lost my arm and it regrew overnight and has been fully restored? You won't find anyone, right? Because no one prays that a amputee will be healed by God by regrowing the limb. We pray that they'll find peace. We pray that their pain and suffering will lead them to a greater understanding of God and his plan for them. But if someone says, my aunt had cancer and was healed through the power of God and Christ, Christians don't blink an eye. They go, yeah, that could happen. But why are amputees exempt from this kind of obvious miraculous healing when in nature, different animals can regrow tails, limbs, insects do it, lizards do it. So it's not like regrowing a limb is outside the bounds of God's creation. But it's funny how no Christian will ever pray for someone to regrow their limb, but they will pray to recover from cancer or a cold or an illness. And so for me, that showed a bit of bias. I was like, if Christians were regrowing limbs miraculously and no other faith was, I'd have to admit there's something going on. So I would be open to statistics. If we really saw miracles happening for one faith and not another, I'd have to concede that that's something that has to be explained and probably isn't natural.
Right. And that's interesting that you brought up for that example. If you did see for the example you said, a limb grow, during a prayer or maybe later on after a prayer, is that something that will shock you into like, oh yeah,
I think it would shock a lot of people. And don't get me wrong, there's people who fake it, people who tie back their leg to look like they're maimed if they're begging or if they're busking or whatever. People have faked losses of limbs before, but we live in a very modern time. We have a lot of people, soldiers coming back from wars. We have a lot of evidence, doctors who document amputees. It would be a trivial thing to thoroughly document someone who's lost a limb and it was regrown. And I think even to you as Christians, if you found all of a sudden that in like a Muslim faith or a different faith, people were regrowing limbs like genuinely in front of you, I got to imagine that might shake your faith or at least make you think something's going on, right? Because if it's not happening to Christians, why is it happening to this other faith? I think statistics would lead me to possibly believe in a faith, even if I hadn't seen evidence myself.
Yeah, I mean, it would shake the faith as far as what is the narrative of the faith, right? Because go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, we can talk about is this an evil faith? Is this a fake vision? There's always explanations, but so far, everywhere I go, no faith is actually going, yeah, look, statistically, we have better health or, we have more healing just by prayer. Everyone seems equally unlikely to get that. So for me, if statistics showed that a faith could do miraculous things for only one group, that's something I'd have to consider.
And that's where the Christianity is a little bit difficult for you to tie down, because there is no such group of who is a Christian out there or who is not. So when you ask the question of if a Muslim prays and miracles happen for them, which here's the thing about miracles, they're not common at all. Like, they're not supposed to be something that we could say, I prayed and I expect a miracle. It's scientifically, you can't measure it. So I'm not sure how you can make an argument for how to use that to disprove the religion of Christianity if it happens somewhere else, because statistically, you can't. And a lot of these things that we're talking about, miracles, a lot of them in the beginning times where we look at it in the New Testament, they were being done because of the narrative, right? Christ has come, he's done his work for how many ever years he did it, and he's gone. And now the church has to be established in the face of societies and governments and powers that oppose that idea, that very idea. They hate it. And then you have other religious sects that also oppose it. So we're not just talking about something that can just spread naturally. We're talking about something that has to be empowered by some kind of act of external force if it is to propagate, right? Because Christianity today, if you look at other places in the world, Christians are prosecuted to a high degree. If you go to Africa, they're prosecuted to a really high degree. China, India, a lot of places. So Christianity isn't something that you could just say miracles happen for them and them only. As a matter of fact, miracles happen to people outside of Christianity. And again, I'm saying miracles, but it's really difficult to say miracles.
No, I get
Acts
you.
of spiritual, supernatural things happen outside of Christianity because it has to, in order for them to come to. So if you say this Muslim experienced this supernatural thing, but they don't claim to be a Christian, well, you can't really use that as an argument for, well, then that, that's not a Christian thing, so I can use that against Christianity because.
Oh yeah, yeah. I would never say that if a Muslim said a miracle happened that disproves Christianity. I was just pointing out that if any one faith seemed to have very obvious miracles statistically, I have to give some investigation and weight to that to be like something's going on that I can't explain. And if it was Christianity, fine. If it was Muslims, real quick, you said something about story and talking. I found examples. Again, this isn't new, right? When we talk about like the gospel, like the 500 or like the roadside visitations by Jesus to the various followers, a lot of that, from what I can see, are tropes of stories, because there are Greek stories of people who vanish in a storm and then appear later to like a noble on a road going, I have ascended to heaven, you're going to carry my words forward. I think many Christians would be surprised at how much of the New Testament Gospels are using story tropes that came before in Greek stories. There's stories of Vespasian, who was, I think, an emperor who healed the blind by spitting in someone's eyes, healed the maimed, died, and had visitations on the road from people who then came back and said, I met Vespasian, he said this, he's now in heaven. The gospel, we have memes and tropes today in movies and TV shows. The writers back then had tropes too, and I think as you look into it, you'll see the gospel authors were using tropes and stories that their audience would have been familiar with from like Greek sources, and I think that's who they were targeting. Literate Greek converts. And
what
that
would be
makes
the
sense.
point of that? If we're talking about someone comes down the road and just says, "Hey, are you a Christian?" and you say, "Yes, I am an apostle," you're going to death. Why would I want to convince people of a storyline made up in mythology to follow Jesus Christ if I'm going to die for it? Not just death in an excruciating, painful way. Why would I do that?
So I think the original author writers were two things: gathering stories about Jesus. I don't think any of the gospel writers met Jesus. I think the names seem to have come much later in the church history. They're originally anonymous. And I think they were trying to do their take on the Jesus story. Jesus was a figure, there were stories about him, and we even know that there's the exact same language in like Matthew, Mark, and Luke at various points. They were obviously copying a same source, right? I mean, word for word, entire paragraphs are more or less the same. So I think they were putting their own spin on it, whether it was stories they heard or visions they had or intuitions they had. I just think they used, and many times, the tropes of storytelling at that time. If it's common for humans who became divine to have roadside stories. Then when there's a story about Jesus, they put it on a roadside visitation because Greeks would have recognized that trope, right? It made it easier for them to understand. It, reinforced that Jesus was to be taken seriously because it sounded like stories they heard about other human divine figures
that didn't exist.
Oh, I mean, Vespasian existed. He was a real emperor, right? We know he historically existed. I don't think he appeared on a road as a ghost, but I think the gospel writers were using, stories and thought. This is where, it's interesting from a scholarship standpoint that they were using stories and story structures. Just like today, if you wrote something, you might base it off like a comic book or a movie, things that people understand, like the 3-act structure. The gospel writers were just using the same thing in Greek philosophy and Greek stories. They were trying to make Jesus seem real to, a Gentile audience. So you use the tools you have.
Why would you need to use such a tool when you have the story of an actual resurrection?
Well, it's all about how you present it, right? Remember, most people were not literate at that time. I think the literacy rate around Jerusalem was maybe 10%, if not lower. And mostly that was well-off people, either scribes who were working or people who could afford to learn to read and write for business or their children. So the one thing I try to remember is the gospel writers are writing at a high level of prose. Right. It doesn't read like an account that you or I would write. Like, these are skilled writers using the tools of their craft in the same way that, Stephen King writes in a certain way that you and I don't, because he's really good at it. So I always try to respect the fact that the way they put it, the tropes they used, the story structure they used was intentional for their audience because they were good at their job. Right? It's not like we're getting gospels that are 500-page manuscript of a day-to-day diary of being with Jesus. We're getting condensed stories with specific goals. That is like an elevated writing experience. And we got to respect that, right? We got to respect that as for what it is, to my mind.
Interesting, because the way you explain things, it sounds like modern time today, if someone were to create a gospel or a new religion, they would have to have very much studied other religions in order to create this religion, because they would be basing some things off of that. So that your claim is essentially the people who wrote the Bible were so well studied on other mythologies that they knew exactly how to communicate to the people who didn't understand.
Yep. This is what scholarship has showed me. Like there's a story, I think it's around Tyre, where at some point there's like a story where like the priest has these certain gems on a breastplate. And scholars are like, yeah, that references a story outside of Israel, right? But it was a well-known story. It's a reference to that. When, you look at the New Testament and this idea of the Logos, there were people like, something of Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jew living before Christ was born in Egypt, talking about Logos theology. Like, what was the Logos? Because they were looking at it through a Greek lens. Like, the idea of a prime mover that's not affected by his creation really came from Stoicism and Greek thought. And the more you look at this, the more you go like, what is John talking about? Why does the word of God have this kind of connotation? Why are some of the gospel authors talking about how like the matters of flesh are evil or wrong and we have to move beyond that? It was the Greek influence. One of the biggest things I would say is when you look at the scholarship, you get an appreciation for how other cultures influenced Old Testament and New Testament authors, just like you would expect today of different cultures influencing each other, because it adds texture to, I think, what the text says.
I would push back on that a little bit and say that it didn't come from Greek influence, because when you look at the Old Testament, the reason why God couldn't lead Israel the way that he desired to was because of their flesh. So it goes way back further than just Greek influence. I would say that these influences are taken from the influence that God had on society, not necessarily, because the way you're talking, it sounds like the Greeks just kind of came about this stuff on their own. It just kind of grew up out of it's almost like a weed, like it just kind of grows up, this thought here, and Christianity kind of pulls from this and that. But if you actually were to study the Bible in its narrative and to understand who really God truly is, not just scholar. That's why sometimes you hear some Christians say, make sure you read the Bible for yourself so you understand based on what you're seeing. But if you go the scholarship route, you're also pulling from things that don't actually make sense. They just they necessarily support your argument for your endpoint, which is, look, see, I'm a naturalist, because they're explaining things away. Whereas talking to you, I get the sense that you're studying a certain kind of scholarship work, because there are other scholarship work that would speak against what you're talking about. So
I get your point. Yeah, I try not to do that. And the example I'll give is looking at, you're familiar with the prophecy of the virgin birth, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
This seems to be, most modern day scholars would say it wasn't about a future birth. It was someone who was pregnant at the time, a young woman who was pregnant at the time, and the sign was to King Ahaz, right? So, I can look at different scholarship, but one thing I did go to was the ESV, which is a very conservative book. I got the study Bible version of the ESV, and they clearly state that Jesus is God. The prophecies support him. Like they're not messing about. They're going to be as conservative as a study Bible as I think you'll find. But even they acknowledge that, when you look at that verse in the study Bible, they say, listen, there's disagreement here. We now think this was a prophecy about Jesus. But man, that buzzer's loud. I like it. But the ESV, again, very conservative, says, but you can read this verse about a prophecy or a sign that was just to King Ahaz, and it had a fulfillment in the time of King Ahaz, and that is okay. We believe it's also a prophecy about Jesus, or there was a secondary fulfillment in Jesus. But even they acknowledge that the story works without Jesus. And so I do try to look at conservative sources too, right? Because I want to understand what the authors are saying. So I do try to look at both, right? I'm not just here to go, and this means the Bible's not true. Because honestly, I don't think me saying that would change anyone's mind.
I mean, it would bring, well, we're out of time now, but
yeah.
Eddie Ed, what do you got?
I mean, you can go ahead and finish your last statement, and then we can move forward here.
Sure. You saying the Bible isn't true, of course, won't change any minds, just as much as if I said the Bible was true would change anyone's mind. I think the conversation would have to be had without bias, so to say, because no Christian became a Christian because they had a bias for Christ, right? And so if we're talking about you were raised Christian, then of course there would be some bias, but a lot of Christians actually fall away from being raised Christian and then come back to it later. Which would kind of speak to your what you mentioned earlier, some kind of study of psychology. I forget which
parapsychology.
Oh, the supernatural, the scientific study of the supernatural, parapsychology. Yeah,
right. Which then the person would have a bias from being raised that way. But of course, that whole thing has to be had, because now we're diving into the conversation of, well, if someone is pushed toward a bias, then where does that bias come from? And is that bias grounded in reality? And then we start to talk about objective, subjective, how it works in society, why it works in society, why we all experience some of the same things. So I think this is a really robust conversation that I don't think would be able to be solved if I just said Christianity is true or you said Christianity is not true. There's so many little things. And I wasn't too sure of your points saying that certain prophecies actually didn't come to be true because they were changed and such. I'm not well studied in that, so that would be something I would have to go back and evaluate myself. But I am pressed to believe that Christianity has been sieged for centuries and still stands, even though there are clear prophecies that didn't exist. And I'm pushed to believe that there's more context around it. So that's on me to do more research.
Yeah,
right?
and I'll say I'm happy to email you if you ever want to do a one-on-one. I'm happy to share my sources, because I always want to say, I'm not a scholar. I'm getting to some scholars, and context is super important, right? Don't rip a verse out. So yeah, I agree. And again, good Christian scholarship and even the early church fathers wrestled with this kind of stuff. There's a lot more we could talk about, but this is not new. Christians have been wrestling with prophecies and how to interpret them, and for a long time. And yeah, I agree. Look at the scholarship from all sides. So I support that. If you ever want to talk about it, let me know.
Sweet.
All
That's
right.
my case.
Well, D, take it away. Actually, yeah, there's a lot to still be said about this, but we don't have enough time. Obviously, we're at the end of the time. So if you're watching, drop your thoughts down below. If you have any disagreements, agreements about anything we said, drop it down below. But D, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah. Also to the person in the chat who was talking about we don't have any ability to interact with our viewers. I mean, if you pose a question that doesn't fall in line with something that we're going to ask or ask later on, we're not going to engage with that. You guys can engage in the chat, but we had structure for how this should go. So we were asking him questions that we had predetermined, and he was answering them. So if he had a question regarding a specific topic, I would have liked for you to pose that question very clearly, not a question like, is this a chat question or is this a specific question? But Fallon, we have about 5 more minutes. We would like to give you maybe about 2 to 3 minutes to state your final case, and then we will move on from there.
And actually, it's James.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
James. Yeah.
It's okay. I finally dropped the moniker. It's all good. No, first of all, again, thank you to both of you. You've been incredibly kind, allowed me to come back on, especially since I missed the window last week. Yeah, I think my main point is, I'm never here to tell someone that Christianity is false. I don't think it's true, but what I really want to focus on is the scholarship and trying to bring to light things about the Bible that, Christians may not know about, or even non-Christians, and talk about those things, because I think it gives a lot of insight and structure to the work that I think many Christians never get to experience, because it's not really talked about as much, because it's often drier or a little more academic. But I do appreciate everything you've let me to talk about. You've been incredibly kind and understanding, and yeah, I was happy to sort of walk through my worldview and my experiences here, and hopefully gave some insight into this one atheist's current belief structure. So again, thank you so much.
Yeah. And I would say he did a great job as well. This was a conversation at the end of the day. We wanted to stay away from the debate type of thing, because a lot of them proved to be unproductive. People are trying to convince the audience rather than have an engaging conversation. Of course, debates have their place as well, but we wanted more of a conversation and really explore some things.
Right.
So I'm sure James took away some things. I surely did, that I have some work to do myself. Everyone always has work to do. It's a human way of life. So I don't want to say I have the facts, and if you don't believe it, then you're an idiot and you don't deserve to have an opinion.
Yeah.
And I will add to that. And I will add to that to say, the questions that James you posed, and had is gonna make me even get better. And to me, it's gonna make me have a stronger faith, because I'm going to discover some things that maybe I didn't look into, before hearing the question that you asked or whatever it is. So for people that's out there, listening and thinking that, oh, maybe his questions are dumb or whatever, take a chance and discover some things that would actually build upon, what you actually, understand through the Bible, or whatever the other questions may pose you to, discover. So he asked some very insightful questions, which I believe he would say the same thing on our side, to just
absolutely,
food for thought.
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, all we understand is history is extremely robust, and no one knows everything, right? So these conversations always have to be had. Thank you guys for joining in. We really appreciate the conversation that was going on. Remember to comment, like, and share the video. Drop your thoughts below, even after the video has been posted. We really do like engaging with you guys in the comments. That's how James ended up here.
Yeah.
I don't know if they know the story of how he actually got here. So, but he was somebody that was in the comments sharing his thoughts, and we had a conversation in the comments, and we said, hey, let's bring it on the show if you're willing, and then here it is. So we encourage you guys to, hey, drop your thoughts in the comments. Maybe there's something that we can talk about.
For
yeah,
sure.
you guys do great conversations. I encourage anyone who has questions for you or even, agrees with you, definitely reach out to them because they've been nothing but gracious and professional. So definitely.
Yeah, that means a lot, man. That means a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, guys, comment, like, and share. And also we have streams every week on Sundays, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, and then 4:30 to 5 as well. So come join in, come have some fun. Go ahead.
And also we might be switching it up here and there, but by doing hour slots here. So just have your notifications on so you know when we're going live, and you'll be able to join as soon as we go live.
Yeah. So lastly, guys, don't be scared again, because we've done this in the past where we're like, hey, you want to come on the show and defend your points in real time, and people usually ghost after that comment. So we're here to show that we don't bite. We just want to ask questions into your perspective and have you explain it. So without further ado, Eddie Ed, do you have anything else?
Yeah, once again, we're just two Christian guys having a conversation.
Yeah.
And as our theme goes, we're only holy
because he is, folks. And remember, faith don't come expensive.
It's free.
It's free, folks. Peace.
Thanks for watching The Holy Duo.